Thanks, Peter. And welcome everybody to a frosty morning here in Sydney. I've no doubt it's in different temperatures in part of the country, but it's very good of you to be up and about this early in the morning, attending our fellowship. And I'd like to explain a few things about it. First of all, we've been meeting for quite a long time, and I think most people who belong to this fellowship really appreciate the first element in this, which is friendship. And I think that friendship is deepened by the fact that we're considering topics in these talks which really affect the meaning of life, the meaning of our lives, and test the question, does faith in God really have any practical day-to-day implications? Does it affect the way we work? Does it affect our relationships with our families, et cetera, et cetera? So that's our theme, but our basic vibe, if you like, is friendship. And so, friends, I welcome you to this morning, and I hope you're going to have a great time and you'll come back because we have a lot of other things that we do together as friends. Now, introducing John. John's been with us before, and we welcome him back. I'm delighted in many senses that John is with us, coming from a family that originates in Northern Ireland. It's always nice to see a fellow countryman. So John, I think, let's put him into some sort of context. John's a professor of mathematics and had a distinguished career in mathematics. But I sort of see his role now as being to challenge the cultural zeitgeist that comes particularly out of universities and which reinforces skepticism, atheism, and questioning of spiritual authority of any dimension. John, I think, challenges this in a very amenable way, and I'm sure you're going to leave the meeting today feeling like you've learned something from him. He comes in a long line of great thinkers from Oxford, people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and others. So I think we're going to have a great morning. Welcome, John. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be in Australia. I'm sitting outside Oxford, and the temperature's been around 31 degrees centigrade. So my apologies that I can't transport anything more than my image. I can't send the heat to you, but it's lovely to be in Australia again. I've had such wonderful memories of visiting your country several times in the past. So this is a real honor to be with you.
Well, thank you, John, also for staying up till 10 p.m. to be with us. John, you last addressed the Men's Fellowship all the way back on the 22nd of May, 2020, and little did we know what was going to be in store for us over the next couple of years. Thankfully, you've survived, clearly. You're with us. What's been your experience over these past couple of years?
Well, as I look back over the last couple of years, I'm very grateful that COVID has not affected me at all. I've had 4 vaccinations, but apparently I've not got anywhere near having the disease. But in the first week of lockdown, being a mathematician, I began to think, what can I do? Because this looks as if it's going to settle in for the long haul. And I thought perhaps I can write something about the issues that this epidemic that's going to spread exponentially very rapidly and be very frightening. Can I write anything meaningful into the big questions that this is going to throw up? And of course it did. The vulnerability of us as human beings to pandemics, the whole question of the meaning of life and death, and all these big questions. So in the first week, I devoted myself to writing a short book called Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And I've just been amazed because I don't have any simplistic answers to these questions. I was trying to point people to the possibility, if you like, a window through which I think we might be able to proceed towards something satisfying. And there was a huge reaction, and it's now in, 35 languages or something like that. And the other thing that's happened is that lockdown has stopped me traveling and enabled me to write a number of books So in that sense, selfishly, it's been very productive. And Zoom has allowed me to reach across the world. And I stopped counting, but it's somewhere between 400 and 500 sessions since the initial lockdown. So it's lovely to be with you, Zoombies, today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Has there been anything which has surprised you over the last couple of years, either in terms of the pandemic or perhaps response to it?
Well, various things have surprised me. First of all, it has led to a lot of people questioning science, and we can come to that in a moment too. The other thing that's interesting, that many pastors reported to me that although their congregations dropped on times to zero, their actual Zoom congregations were much bigger than they normally got at church. So instead of destroying interest in a spiritual dimension to life and asking the big questions, that was actually stimulated. And I found that around the world, and had some very surprising opportunities in South America, for example, to speak to 100,000 young people at once. That kind of thing was just phenomenal. So a lot of interest generated in big questions and people seriously wanting to hear what you had to say.
Well, let's come back to the point you said that some people are questioning the science. Here in Australia, no doubt it's the same in the UK. We often heard our political leaders saying, we're following the science. It was a bit surprising that each state came up with their own rules, but perhaps that's a different topic. I guess what I'd like to really explore is belief in a God in conflict with following the science. But before we really dive into the meat of that, I think in the interest of disclosure, it's probably good you tell us your own story, your journey to belief, but also to becoming a maths professor.
Well, I first encountered Christianity in the lives of my parents, and it was credible. And that's saying something, because Northern Ireland at that time was becoming increasingly sectarian, and that flared up in violence. And both sides, some of them professed to be Christian. And what was very interesting about my parents was that my father tried to employ people from both the Catholic and the Protestant side. And when I said, isn't that very risky? He said, yes, it's risky. But I believe the statement that all human beings, irrespective of worldview, are made in the image of God. I'm going to treat them like that. That left a profound effect on me, Peter. The second thing is, my parents loved me enough to give me space to think and come to my own conclusions. And they not only introduced me to Christianity as a refreshing breath of air that was open-ended and encouraged interest in everything, they allowed me to make up my own mind and fed me with information, not simply from the Christian worldview, but from other worldviews. And that, in my early days, and I mean before I was a teenager, got me interested in the bigger picture. And as I went on, I loved languages, still do, but I ended up doing mathematics. And I was interested in where does mathematics fit into science, and where does science fit into the big picture? And so I started reading as a teenager, and very rapidly discovered something that has lived with me, and that is that the major pioneers of science, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, they were all believers, most of them Christian. And I later came across C.S. Lewis's evaluation of that. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, that made a deep impression, because what it got across to me was that faith in God, far from hindering these people to make massive contributions to science, was actually the motor that drove it. And I've never seen any reason to change my mind on that. In fact, the evidence has increased that true science and true faith in God do not conflict. They complement each other because mainly they're different ways of looking at things. And that's a very important thing, that science is powerful, as we've seen, producing vaccinations and all of that, but it's powerful because it's limited and it can't answer every question. And I devote a lot of my life now to try to point out that science is wonderful. It doesn't tell us everything. There's a whole other universe of ideas out there that has to do not with assembling facts, as the left side of our brain does, but is more right brain. That is, it's interpreting meaning. And Ian McGilchrist, who's a brilliant neuroscientist, has just published a magisterial book that some people are claiming now is the most important book written this century, in the last 100 years, called The Matter of Things. And he makes the point that what has happened, sadly, is that particularly in the West, we've concentrated on left-brained analysis, and we've thought that gives us everything. And we've let go that side of our brain and our mind that actually opens up to us meaning and purpose and deals with not simply knowledge, but knowledge in the sense of knowledge of people and knowledge of purpose. So those are a lot of big ideas, but that's the kind of way I'd approach this.
Why, John, do you think there has been this narrowing of attention, just in your words, to the left side of our brains?
It's to a certain extent a puzzle. It's partly a moral thing, as is admitted by some leading thinkers. They don't want there to be a God. It's partly because professing Christian churches have done often a very bad job at giving answers to deep intellectual questions. They haven't been living up to what they should be doing. And also that zeitgeist, the idea of getting somehow to the stage where the dominant feature of academia in this country and elsewhere is scientism. Science is the only way to truth, and the glorification of science and technology, which has meant that many people simply not only follow the science, but they follow that misinterpretation of science. So I see it as a very complex situation. You meet leading scientists who will just tell you straight, attitude to God's nothing to do with my science. I don't want there to be a God. I simply want to do as I like. Now, if they say that, I find that a very honest thing. But I want to raise very big questions, because once you begin to see that science doesn't tell us everything, then the big questions come. What is the rest of the story? Is there something else? And I meet more and more people. To answer your question, I see a trend going back to saying, look, there's got to be something more. And I know many people who are not theists, they're not Christians, but they will tell me straight, there's got to be something more. And I would like to find out what it is.
Well, let's dive into one of those, or perhaps the most fundamental question. And I'd be interested in how you approach this, both from the perspective as a scientist and clearly as a believer in a God. Why is there anything? Why do we even exist? How do you approach it?
That's a great question of Leibniz, apparently. Why is there something rather than nothing? And I think it still remains the basic question, and it doesn't go away. And my answer to it is that there is something that, and thing is the wrong word for it. It leads to the question, what is the ultimate reality? Is it nothing, or is it God? Now, I put it as polarizedly as that, because what I see offered to us these days in the name of physics is that nothing, whatever that means, created everything. Or from the theistic perspective, and my perspective as a Christian, that God created everything. God is not nothing, but he's not physical. And therefore, It seems to me that the answer to the question that makes most sense, and this is important because we cannot repeat the history of the universe to see exactly what happened, but we can use logic at least to think that maybe everything that exists must have a cause. And what is that cause? And for centuries, even millennia, the best answer to that question is the cause is an eternal God. And that is hugely important, that God is. It isn't that God came to exist, as Dawkins and others would suggest, and that's very easy to refute, but that there is a ground of being that is a personal God who is creator. Now, there are many things that we don't know about God. In that sense, he goes way beyond our comprehension. But then I come to the next fact, and that is we live in a world where there is at least the claim that God has revealed himself and he has spoken. Now, you and I know that in many situations we're lost for words. I sat out in the garden today and I was just thinking, in a millisecond, the view I have of the flowers and listen to the birds and all of that, how could I ever put that into words? And the answer is I couldn't. But it's a very real experience of a reality that I believe to be out there. So the fact that we are lost for words when it comes to describing God is not surprising. But on the other hand, if God has used words to speak to us, I think that opens the possibility. And what I'm talking about here, of course, is the concept of revelation.
And why don't we come back to that, John, a bit later? Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, though, in your description of what are the options, you're saying that there could either be some form of creator, or what is the alternative that science does propose?
Well, the alternative that physicists tend to propose these days is what I said, nothing. But when you investigate that, and I've taken it very seriously over the years, you discover that nothing is not nothing. It's something like a quantum vacuum. And what concerns me about that is that you get leading physicists who want to be taken seriously and astrophysicists who talk nonsense. Now, Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, was a genius. And yet, in one of his books written not so long before he died, he tried to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And he said, well, we don't need God because, you see, because there exists a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, I had a preview of that book, and I was astonished when I read that sentence, which is the central statement of his whole book. Because there is a law like gravity, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. Now, to anybody's logic, that's a flat contradiction. But then he goes on to make it worse, in my view. The universe will create itself. Well, now, what could that possibly mean? If I say that X creates Y, roughly speaking, I'm saying if you've got X, it'll produce Y somehow. But if I say X creates X, that's sheer nonsense. And what concerns me is that leading scientists who are brilliant mathematicians and physicists resort to nonsense when it comes to attempting to answer that question, why is there something rather than nothing? Lawrence Krauss is another example who says, in his book, A Universe from Nothing, he says nothing must be physical, even if you define it as the absence of something. Well, if people have to resort to absolute absurdity, and I'm not the only one to say this, there are many atheists saying this, then there's something wrong with their explanation. And perhaps Lord Rees was right when he says, look, he said, Stephen Hawking knows little philosophy and no theology, so it might be better not to listen to him on either of those two subjects, even though Lord Rees, our astronomer royal, is not a theist at all. So here we have two alternatives. A creator makes sense to me for many reasons. A personal creator who creates and upholds the universe, keeps it in being. The idea of nothing producing everything makes no sense at all. So if I've got to choose, I'd rather have an explanation that makes sense to one that doesn't.
Well, let's then dive into a little bit why you think it makes sense. I guess what I'd be interested to hear is what amazes you. You spoke about the progress in neuroscience already, but what amazes you about the properties of life and the universe, and why do you see those as being pointing more to the idea of there being a creator than not being a creator?
Well, what amazes me, first of all, as a mathematician, is the fact that the universe is, at least in part, mathematically intelligible. Now, that's what really moved Albert Einstein, and he called it a miracle. He said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And the fact that the universe is in part describable in terms of mathematics, that points me to intelligence. Mathematics is an intellectual activity, and that we can reduce to a certain extent physical properties, the motion of the planets, for example, as Kepler and Newton did, to a comprehensible language that gives us predictions. Now, that is totally consistent with the idea that behind the universe, there is an intelligent creator who made it that way. And that, of course, was the foundation belief that actually led to the rise of science. I mentioned the pioneers before, but there's a strong connection. And that connection has actually been developed by one of your most brilliant historians of science in Australia, Peter Harrison, whom I got to know when he was in Oxford and before he went back to Australia, pointing out that this thesis that there's a connection between faith in God and the rise of science is very close, as I quoted Lewis on this. That makes a lot of sense to me. And that describability of the universe in language doesn't stop with mathematics. You mentioned living things. Well, we know that part of the biosphere is describable in terms of a genetic language, which is exactly like a computer code. And we speak of the human genome. And we've discovered a word that's longer than any other kind of word that we know. It's in 4 chemical letters, and it's about 3.4 billion letters long. Now, I often test scientists on this, and I show them a word of 4 letters, like EXIT, exit above a door, and they will immediately deduce, without hesitation, that whatever mechanical and physical processes or chemical have gone into producing that sign, there's an intelligence behind it because it's a meaningful word. And therefore, having meaningful mathematics and a meaningful genetic code, that points me in the direction of the fundamental notion that this universe is word-based. And that immediately parallels with one of, I think, the most profound statements, biblical statements about this. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to exist through the Word. So that kind of coalescence, going together of the scientific side, what we've discovered, and also some of the relatively few statements in the Bible about God's creative power and how it was used. That is evidence for me, very strong evidence. Now, of course, you can split that up and investigate in all kinds of directions, but that idea of the word seems to me to be fundamental.
No, thank you, John. So whether it's the fundamental properties of the universe or whether it's even our own individual makeup, you're seeing evidence of, I guess, the fingerprints of a creator, of an intelligent creator. But I'd like to sort of take the discussion then is a slight tangent from there. What do you think's at stake here? So if someone says, well, that's all well and good, but I actually prefer not to believe in any notion of transcendence, why does it matter?
Well, of course, we can prefer to believe or not believe anything we like. That would be a curious, I find, attitude in a scientifically thinking person, because I've been endowed with a very profound sense of curiosity, and I want to know, but in particular, I'm interested in truth. I'm interested in the truth about the situation, because if I simply say, well, I prefer not to believe in any kind of transcendence, and I certainly don't want to believe in God, and if people say that to me, I will ask them why. And you get a whole load of answers. You get answers like, well, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's relevant. Or if there is a God, I might have to give account of my life, and I don't want that either. And people can come up with those different things. Now, the question of truth raises its head here. You see, if it is true that there is a God who created us, that raises the stakes very high indeed, because it could be that we are created for a purpose. Now, all of us, I believe, are looking for purpose in life, and we have purposes at various levels, going to university, studying, getting a job, getting married, and all this kind of thing. But that raises a very ancient question that the Greeks asked: is there any ultimate purpose? Is there any purpose that's not just a means to another one? The biblical claim is that God has a purpose for us and a meaning for us that we can discover through a relationship with him that is possible. Now, if that is true, I'm amazed at people that wouldn't be interested at least to find out about that. I often say to people, look, don't throw away what Christianity has to say, or even what theism has to say, without listening to what it has to say, because it would be a pity to be deaf to a possibility that would fill your life with meaning. Now, that whole issue, I discover, and I'm 80 next year, and I've met a lot of people in a long time, the issue of meaning, a sense of well-being in life, a sense of fulfillment, is something that many people find very elusive, and they notice it more and more as they get older. What do I have to live for? Now, that doesn't prove that God exists, but it certainly is a pointer that let's have a look at the claim that there is something more and see what happens if we take it seriously. Otherwise, we'll never find out.
But that then raises another issue for us. Granted that belief in some form of transcendent God, even a personal God, might give you a sense of purpose and meaning, but how do you account for the randomness, the seeming randomness of life? So, for example, very tragically, some of us on this call are actually going to attend a funeral next Friday of a 15-year-old boy who passed away from a very, very rare form of cancer. So how do you make sense of something like that?
Well, this is the hardest question anyone faces. Not simply me as a Christian theist, but anyone faces. And I've just been faced with that question recently. They found cancer at the back of my ear. They think they've got it all, but they're not sure. So I've had to face that at a limited level. And with the coronavirus pandemic and all the rest of it, and it's why I wrote my little book, to try and point out to people that there are two ways of approaching this. The first is the intellectual way, and that generally is the question of people who are not suffering themselves. But then there's the pastoral aspect. How do you help and encourage and give hope to people who are actually suffering? And this is a huge topic. So two things very briefly. Firstly, if you say, as many people I know do say, and I sympathize with them, if you say, I couldn't possibly believe in God, say because of the Holocaust. I've been to Auschwitz many times and wept every time. And if you say, I don't believe in God because of that, I'll say, look, I sympathize with you totally. It breaks my heart to see what's happened to your relatives or this kind of thing. But if you remove God, then you may think you've removed the problem. In a sense, you have. It's just random and you have to accept it. But what you've also removed is all possible hope. Now, that may be the way it is, and we have to face that. But the alternative, let's bring in the alternative, which is very difficult to grasp initially. And that is, God is not some impassive creator who has distanced himself. But the heart of Christianity talks about a suffering God. And the idea of the fact, and we have to listen to it and see if it makes any sense before we reject it. The central claim of Christianity is that God has actually visited our planet, and that Christ, when he died on the cross, was suffering for us. Now, whatever that means, it tells me that God has not remained distant. If Christ really is God, related to him in some deep, deep identity sense, then that begins to give me hope. And where I get hope from, Peter, in the last analysis, and I'm embarrassed cutting a wonderful story far too short, and that is the fact, if Jesus had stayed on the cross, we'd never have heard of him. But if it's true that on the third day, and I believe it as a scientist, with all my mind and heart, if he rose from the dead, that changes everything, because it means that death is not the end. And there we can begin to see hope. Hope of what? Hope that God, whom I believe has demonstrated himself to be righteous, will sort all this out one day. Now that is hard stuff. That's big stuff. But I believe it for several reasons. One, because the atheist alternative gets you nowhere. It leaves you in a world with no hope. That may be the case, as I've said. I don't believe it is. The other side leaves you with pain, with suffering, but it gives you real hope. 14 years ago, I said goodbye to my wife. They thought I was about to die of a massive heart attack. And in that moment, all I can say is I had complete peace. Why? Because I knew I'd see my wife again. And therefore, I believe that Christianity has real hope to offer. But for many, it will be hope that has a deferred fulfillment, like the boy that you mentioned. And our hearts break. And I notice in the Gospels, there's a story of Jesus weeping at a grave, and that's the appropriate thing to do. Death is an enemy. But one of the wonderful claims, I think, that Paul made, the apostle, is that death is not the end, and eventually there will be a massive victory over death in the future. That gives me real hope, even if coronavirus or cancer or whatever takes me away.
Well, let's perhaps just explore this a bit further, but again, coming at the angle of what contribution is this really making to our society? Because some would say that, we'd really be better off without any religions. Religions polarize our society. Why do you think, or perhaps you want to comment on that, but then further, why do you think your hope, your vision of what Christianity offers would be a solution and not actually adding to the problem of further polarization?
Well, first of all, if you're going to argue that getting rid of religion will solve the problem, then you'd better get rid of atheism much faster. Because in the 20th century, the track record of atheism, and if you read, for example, the book by atheist John Gray called Black Mass, you'll have no doubt as to the hundreds of millions of people who died as a result of atheistic philosophies. But that's not the argument I want to bring. It depends what religion we're talking about. Not all religion is the same. And often religion is simply a prescription of how you must try to live in order to satisfy some rules and get some kind of acceptance by some kind of God or ultimate reality. Well, I'm not religious in that sense, because my faith in God is a personal relationship. And what is that to contribute? Well, one only has to read the accounts of people that have really suffered seriously to realize, people like Joni Eareckson Tada and so on, to realize what God can do in people's lives to enable them to cope with it. And, you know, the sad thing, and this refers to my Northern Ireland background, people often say, look, it's absurd you trying to be a Christian when you've got that background, because there's a classic example of a religion being used to kill people. And it was because people were not obeying Christ, but disobeying him. And that's important for me. Many people have failed to realize that when Christ was put on trial, he was put on trial for terrorism. And Pilate, the Roman procurator, who decided to test the case himself because it was so serious, declared him innocent. Now, this is hugely important. And I want to say very clearly, as an Irishman, that people that take AK-47s to promote any religion, but worst of all, to promote Christ or his message, are not following him. They're disobeying him. He said, if you take the sword, you perish by the sword. And when Pilate pushed the question, because Pilate thought that Jesus was competing with him for authority over the country, he said, look, I'm not competing with you politically. My kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting, and he could see they didn't. But to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth. And thereupon Pilate uttered his famous, perhaps not so cynical statement, what is truth? And declared Christ innocent, because he could see, as a hardened soldier and politician, that the one thing you cannot do with power and force and violence is to impose truth. And it's that attitude of Christ that makes me think, if we were following that, Christopher Hitchens put this to me once, your very question. I said, Christopher, if you understood what Christ stood for, you'd be on his side, not against him, because he actually made it very clear that that kind of attitude was completely wrong.
Okay, no, thank you. That's very clear. We will soon turn, gentlemen, for you to have the opportunity to ask your questions. So you might want to start thinking which questions you'd like to ask. And again, use the raised hand function if you wish to ask a question. But John, before we turn to the men's questions, just to pull some of the threads together, you've said that suffering is a real challenge to thinking through this question of belief. Have there been any other challenges for you? If you think about where we're at in terms of our knowledge of the universe, of science, of the human body, etc., has anything in any way challenged your obviously clear, firm belief in a personal, loving God?
Well, there was an attempt made to break my faith when I was a student, and it left a deep mark. I met a Nobel Prize winner at my college in Cambridge, and he asked me, he said in front of witnesses, if you want to make a career in mathematics, just give up this naive faith in God right now in front of witnesses, because otherwise you'll never make it. And I'm so glad that happened. I was 19 at the time. I'd never met a Nobel Prize winner. And to sit in front of him, I mean, it was a terrifying thing. But somehow I got the courage to say, sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what is supplied in the Christian message. And he came out with philosophy of Émile Bergson, which was a very bad choice, as I discovered later. And I said, if that's all you've to offer me, then I'll take the risk and stick with what I've got. And I think that put steel into my heart, really, because I resolved on that day, even though I was young, that ever I was in that kind of position, the last thing I would do would be to browbeat people like that. You know, if he'd been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd done that, he'd probably have lost his job the next day. Such is our society. So that was a challenge. And through life, I've been constantly challenged. But you see, what I've done, Peter, in my life is, instead of ducking the questions right from the beginning, from my first days as a student, I've opened myself up to the questioning and made myself vulnerable. For a very simple psychological reason, because people constantly say, oh, all you Irish, you believe in God and you fight about it. And, you know, that Freudian objection is something that weighs heavily with many people. So I like to explain that it works as a double-edged sword. If God is my wish fulfillment, then what about atheism? Could that be yours, that you don't want to meet God? And of course, many people say it is. That kind of argument gets nowhere. But I've tried as much as I can to read literature and to meet people. That's why I spent a lot of time in the communist world during the Cold War, talking to people about why they do not believe in God. And the net result has been, although there have been many challenges, it has massively strengthened my faith in God through those experiences.
Mm. So it's not just perhaps what the science may throw up, it's the...
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I would add that science is only one small part of it. The other part of our brain, if you like, the right-hand side with relationships, seeing what faith in God does to change people's lives for the better, has been one of the most powerful evidences to me of the truth of Christianity. I mean, the crude examples are when students at their wits' end, maybe contemplating suicide, narcotic dependent, and you meet them 6 months later and they're radiant. And you say, what's happened to you? And they may put it differently. And they say, well, I became a Christian, or I met Christ, or but the change is absolutely real. And if I hadn't observed that in myself, in my family, in many, many other people, then I wouldn't be talking to you tonight. Because in the end, this is a relational thing. And it must have an impact on our relationships, on the quality of our life, and the quality of our character, of course. Otherwise, there's no point in being interested at all.
Well, thank you, John. Let's turn to questions.
Hi, John. Thank you. I'm just looking at the nature, or thinking about the nature of faith, and what's the difference between your nature or your understanding of faith, and say someone who's reached the conclusion of a multiverse or some other explanation for the universe's existence. You've spoken particularly about your personal faith or belief in a personal relationship with a creator. Are there any other differences that somebody who believes in an alternative existence without a God, or even another form of God that isn't personal, can you elaborate on their nature of faith and how you see the differences coming about?
Well, faith is an ordinary word, and it means believing something. And in my view, if you've no evidence for believing that, that's very suspect. And all of us know what evidence-based faith is, especially if we go to get money from a bank to have a mortgage. The bank manager will want evidence that we are trustworthy. Now, all of us exercise faith. You believe that there was going to be a session tonight, or you wouldn't be talking to me. And there's faith in facts and propositions and all that kind of thing, in mathematics and physics and science. And then there's faith in people, trust, belief in our families and friends and all this kind of thing. So there are really two divisions of it. Now, you opened your question by saying, what about people who believe in a multiverse? Now, that's a very specific question. And I know a number of Christians who are strong believers in God who do believe in the multiverse, because the multiverse is not an argument against the existence of God. So perhaps that's not the best example. And I've written about it in my little book on God and Stephen Hawking, if you're interested. There's a revised version came out just a few months ago. But differences into that whole picture, you will get people speaking like Richard Dawkins and several atheists, not so loudly today as they used to, but they say faith is a religious word that means believing where there's no evidence. Now, that's sheer nonsense. That's blind faith, and that's very dangerous. So that what I'm pleading for is that we proportion our trust, our faith, to the evidence. But it's not simply about believing certain facts, although facts are very important. We need to know about Christ and what he did before we can put our trust in him as a person, just as you need to get to know colleagues and certain facts about them before you put your personal trust in them. But understanding it in that kind of way opens up the fundamental issue that what are the grounds for my believing this? And in the end, we've got to go for what we believe there is evidence for. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's how I would begin to answer it.
Let's take a question from Mark.
Hi, John. Thanks for speaking to us this morning. My question is about consciousness. What do you think about consciousness? Do you have an understanding of what it is, and does that relate at all to AI?
Well, first of all, it's not only me, but no one knows what consciousness is. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about it just at the moment. And as I read the literature on AI and interact with people that are working in the field, perhaps the most famous person, as you know, in the world is Peter Norvig, who's written the kind of Bible of AI. And he's very open about saying, look, we're not trying to create a consciousness because we don't know what it is, of course. We have absolutely no idea. But what we want to do is to simulate what a conscious being would do. And it's the imitation game, if you want to put it in the words of Alan Turing. And many of the researchers at the moment are perfectly happy to simulate intelligence. But in human beings, I believe God has put two things together, and that is consciousness and intelligence. But in these machines, the word intelligent, which you need to use carefully, because it simply means that a typical AI system, narrow AI of the kind that works these days, does something that normally requires an intelligent human being to do. And that is why we say it's artificially intelligent. And that word artificial needs to be stressed. So I'm sorry, I don't know what consciousness is. I've never met or read anyone who does. But one of the most interesting books on the topic has just come out. I mentioned it earlier. It's called The Matter of Things by Ian McGilchrist. But that would take us a long way away. I don't think we're remotely near. This reflects statements by friends who are pioneers in AI, that we're remotely near understanding consciousness, and certainly we cannot recreate what we don't understand.
We'll go to Ian Harper.
John, good morning from our side. Good evening to you. Lovely to hear you always. John, like yourself, I've spent much of my career around university campuses and the academy more broadly. I was just wondering if you'd care to comment on what you've seen by way of changes in the mood on campus, in particular with respect to accepting claims such as the claims of Christ that are absolutist, while many of our colleagues, as you know, emphasise diversity and the importance of the academy encouraging lots of different views. Even within the academy itself, there are objections to claims of absolute nature being made, for example, by the physicists over against what the sociologists and others would want to say about the nature of truth. Anyway, just a view from your own experience about how you think things are on campus.
Well, I've just come back this evening from dinner in my college in the university, and I can think of at least 5 conversations with fairly distinguished academics, all of whom just are fascinated that I would believe in God. And they ask deep questions, but they don't seem to have been infected very much by what you're referring to, the kind of social critique of science, that it's all a construct and doesn't correspond to reality, and so on and so forth. I find there's an openness which has partly come about because the strident voices of the ancient new atheists are very muted these days. And there is a definite swelling. And forgive me for mentioning Ian McGilchrist again, but he's very interesting because he's not a theist, he's not a Christian, but he is pushing very hard the fact that there is something more. And I find that a way in, a start with people. And I know quite a number of scientists who aren't remotely Christian or even theist, but they feel there's something more and they want to ask questions and find out about it. We're not quite in the UK overwhelmed by political correctness and wokeness and all this kind of thing as has happened elsewhere. Although you can see this coming. The cancel culture is another example of it, and there have been some bad examples of that. But you asked me for my experience, and perhaps I've just escaped, but I don't meet much of that in Oxford. Our Vice-Chancellor has been pretty strong against that and allowing people's opinions, so to speak, to stand. So there's a fair degree of freedom of speech, but I know a lot of questions are being asked and people get worried.
We have a question on the text because the audio couldn't work. Where does maths exist? Does it exist in the human mind or in the mind of God?
Yes.
Next question.
Well, exactly. The way that kind of question is usually formulated is maths discovered or created? And I think in a sense it's both. That this idea of imago Dei, that humans are created in the image of God, I think is a hugely important idea. And it was fascinating just a few nights ago to listen to one of the world's top AI researchers, Rosalind Pickard. I don't know whether you've had her in Australia, but if you haven't, you should, who has developed a whole field of computing. And she's a Christian thinker. It's called affective computing. And she was making the point that if we're going to police artificial intelligence, we probably need to get back to the idea of the imago Dei, that is, humans made in the image of God. And therefore, to come to this question directly, we are creative. So I believe that in my career, I discovered a little mathematics. But there's a very famous Hungarian mathematician, Pál Erdős, who was absolute genius. He traveled around the world and he always knocked on mathematicians' doors and would say, "My mind is open," and he would be received with open arms because he was so bright that the next morning there would be a new result produced and published with Pál Erdős. So he would say of the mathematical results, they're in the book. And the idea was that there's a book up there somewhere in some kind of Platonic world where all the results exist. So I presume in the mind of God, yes, but I do think that God has made us creative and we can do art and music and all these important things. But I think mathematics belongs to that to a certain extent.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. We've got a question from Tang Law.
Good morning from Adelaide, John. Thank you very much for your talk. We've covered the topic of antagonism of faith in universities, but do you think or do you feel that there is an equivalent problem at the other end of the spectrum, that there is an antagonism against science in churches or perhaps even in theological colleges? I'm asking this from the point of view of having experienced a lot of anti-vaxxers and antagonism against Darwinism in my church.
This is a very sad thing that we hear about from time to time. And I fear that certain segments of the Christian church have an anti-science tradition. For what reason, I'm not sure, whether it's fear, and you meet it in some parts of the United States where young people will be warned by their pastors not to go near science because it will destroy their faith in God. And you're quite right, it exists. And I think the fundamental question is, what do we do about it? And we can only do about it what we each individually can do. And I've spent a lot of my life encouraging particularly Christians, but not only Christians, to get into science and get to understand. And a lot of the problems come from not understanding science at all, or very little indeed. And I fear a lot of that is the fault of Christian pastors and teachers. They haven't tried to answer the questions that their congregations ask them, and often that's through fear or because they're not qualified. And the sad thing is, often in those congregations, there will be scientifically trained people who could answer those questions, but they're not really encouraged to come forward. And therefore, the young people vote with their feet and they disappear. So you're pointing up a real question that varies from place to place. And I just think, and I'm sure you're doing that anyway, that you're working against it as best you can as an individual and showing people there's another way.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your questions. It's turned 11 p.m. in the UK, so very grateful, John, for your time tonight. Just a few quick things before we will close with a short prayer from Al Stewart. If you've enjoyed this discussion, you will certainly enjoy coming along to one of our small discussion groups, either in person or by Zoom. There'll be an email coming out later this morning seeking your feedback, and you can indicate your interest to sign up for these regular Zoom sessions and also indicate your interest in the small discussion groups that meet every alternate week. So please do consider that when the email comes through. Gentlemen, I hope you've really enjoyed the session, and I'm going to pass to Al Stewart.
Thanks, Peter. I'll lead us in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this time this morning with John. We thank you that you kept him and Sally safe through the whole COVID pandemic. Please keep him in good health. Please give him the energy to keep writing and speaking. Thank you for the wisdom that you've given him. And for all of us, God, we pray, please help us to see the beauty of creation and your fingerprints behind all of this. We pray, please, we'd be men who seek the truth, and we pray that we might find meaning and purpose in knowing you through the Lord Jesus. We ask this in his name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Al. And gentlemen, have a good weekend ahead and see you for our next Zoom in due course. Goodbye.